In California this August, two of America's most infamous brothers sat before the parole board, each with the faintest glimmer of hope. Lyle and Erik Menendez, the wealthy Beverly Hills brothers who shocked the world in 1989 when they gunned down their parents in cold blood. More than 3 decades later, they finally stood a chance at freedom. But the answer came down like a hammer. Denied. And while headlines blared, 3 years until next chance, the truth was stranger. Because hidden inside California's parole system is a legal twist. One that might shorten those 3 years into just 18 months. But that wasn't even the most shocking part of this hearing. Because something else happened, something almost cinematic, that brought Lyle's parole hearing to a halt. And it started with a sound no one in the courtroom expected to hear. This is the story of the Menendez brothers' parole denial. And it begins with the illusion of freedom. On the morning of August 16, 2025, the California Parole Board gathered at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. 2 separate rooms. 2 separate hearings. In one, 56-year-old Lyle Menendez, his hair shaved close, his frame leaner, his eyes weary after 35 years behind prison walls. In another, his younger brother Erik, 54 years old, whose soft-spoken tone belied the fact that he had once fired a 12-gauge shotgun into his mother's face. It was the culmination of years of legal battles. After being resentenced in 2025 under California's youthful offender law, both brothers were finally eligible to seek parole. A chance to argue that the children of privilege who committed one of the most sensational crimes of the 1990s had changed. But as the board members shuffled their papers, everyone in the room already knew. Parole isn't granted easily, especially not to men whose names are synonymous with patricide. Still, the rules required that the brothers be heard. And so, one by one, their fates were laid out. When the decision was read, the words were clinical, yet devastating. Denied. Not just for a year. Not even for 2. But for 3 long years. The board cited their prison misconduct, their lack of full insight into their crimes, and the enduring seriousness of their offenses. It was, in many ways, a foregone conclusion. But here's where the story twists. Because under California law, a 3-year denial doesn't always mean 3 years. Hidden in the fine print of the California Code of Regulations is something called an administrative review. It's a process that allows a denial to be revisited within about 11 to 12 months. If certain criteria are met, like improved behavior, participation in rehabilitation programs, or changes in the law, the parole board can advance the next hearing. Meaning that for Lyle and Erik Menendez, the headline, 3 years, was not entirely accurate. In truth, their next parole hearing could happen in as little as 18 months. A detail lost in the news cycle, but one that carries enormous weight for 2 men who've already spent the majority of their lives behind bars. To understand why the possibility of early parole even matters, you have to understand the long shadow of their crime. It was August 20, 1989, in the glittering neighborhood of Beverly Hills. Inside a $5 million mansion, Jose and Kitty Menendez, wealthy, powerful, and ruthless by many accounts, sat in their den watching television. Moments later, their sons stormed in with shotguns. Lyle, the elder brother, fired first. He shot his father point-blank in the back of the head. Erik followed, unleashing buckshot into his mother's chest and face. By the end, the scene was carnage. Jose Menendez was nearly decapitated. Kitty was unrecognizable. The motive? At first, detectives thought it was a mafia hit. Jose was a Cuban-born entertainment executive with ties to Hollywood. But suspicion soon turned inward. Because just days later, the Menendez brothers were spotted living lavishly, buying Rolex watches, Porsche convertibles, and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. When they were finally arrested, their defense shocked the nation. They claimed years of sexual and physical abuse at the hands of their father. That on the night of the killings, they feared he was about to kill them first. It was a defense that split America in 2. Were the Menendez brothers monsters of greed? or desperate victims who saw no way out. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second delivered guilty verdicts. Both brothers were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And yet, here we are, decades later, talking about parole at all. Because in 2025, California's youthful offender law reopened their case. Suddenly, the words, "without the possibility of parole," no longer meant what they once did. If you think interest in the Menendez brothers faded after the 90s, you'd be wrong. In fact, in 2023, Netflix announced a new season of Ryan Murphy's Monsters anthology. The focus? The Menendez case. For millions of younger viewers, it was the first time they'd even heard of Lyle and Erik. Suddenly, TikTok was flooded with edits, theories, and even sympathy for the brothers. Petitions began to circulate. Social media lit up with hashtags calling for their release. And by the time their parole hearings arrived in 2025, public opinion wasn't nearly as one-sided as it had been in the 90s. For the parole board, that meant two things: enormous public scrutiny and enormous pressure to appear fair. But here's where the story takes its strangest turn. Because as Lyle Menendez sat before the board, answering questions about his past, something unexpected happened. It started as a faint sound in the background. Then, louder. A voice. The unmistakable voice of Erik Menendez. Somehow, audio from his earlier hearing had been piped into the room. A feed, a glitch, or maybe human error. No one knows exactly why. But for several moments, the board heard Erik's testimony bleeding into Lyle's hearing. It disrupted the proceedings. It rattled the room. And in a case already steeped in decades of sensational headlines, it added one more bizarre twist to the story. The parole denial was already devastating for the brothers. But this was a complication that could, in theory, open the door to a legal challenge. Imagine it, a parole hearing, meant to be conducted with strict fairness, interrupted by the voice of your co-defendant. Coincidence? Technical mishap? Or something more? As the room fell silent and Lyle's attorneys exchanged tense glances, one question hung in the air. Would this glitch, this leak, become the very crack the Menendez brothers needed to pry open the door to freedom? To be continued.